Hercule Poirot, The Mask of Many Faces, Part 1. The Invitation of Many Faces. The letter arrived at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, delivered by a young man whose nervous energy filled the quiet hallway of Whitehaven Mansions. He rang the bell twice, as though uncertain of his own purpose, and when George opened the door, the boy thrust the envelope forward with visible relief and fled down the stairs. Hercule Poirot, seated comfortably in his favorite armchair by the window, looked up at once. "A letter, George?" he asked, his voice precise, every syllable neatly shaped. "Yes, monsieur," replied George, examining the envelope with a practiced eye. "No return address. The paper is expensive." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then already it tells us something." He accepted the letter delicately, as though it were a fragile artifact. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, the name Monsieur Hercule Poirot written in a confident, flowing hand. Poirot frowned slightly. "The handwriting," he murmured. "It pretends to be bold, but see here, the hesitation before the P. A person who wishes to appear assured, but is not." George raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had long learned that Poirot's observations required no encouragement. Poirot slit the envelope open with a small silver knife. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, faintly scented lavender, perhaps. Though the fragrance was restrained, intentional dot, he read silently at first. Then his eyebrows rose. Then, very slowly, his lips curved into a thoughtful smile. "Well, well," he said at last. "This promises to be interesting." The letter was brief. "Monsieur Poirot, you are invited to Arden Hall for a gathering unlike any other. There are 7 of us, each with something to hide, each wearing a mask of our own design. Before the week ends, one mask will be torn away, and the truth beneath it will destroy us all. If you believe, as I do, that the human face is the most elaborate lie of all, then you will come." A friend no date was mentioned. No signature. Yet attached to the letter was a train ticket first class from London to the small coastal town of Blackhurst. Departing that very afternoon, Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table beside him. "A mystery invitation?" George ventured. "Sounds rather theatrical, monsieur." "Ah, but life, George, is theatrical," Poirot replied. "Especially when people believe they are playing roles. And this is not merely an invitation. It is a challenge." "To what?" "To my little gray cells," Poirot said, tapping his temple gently. "And perhaps to my conscience." Arden Hall stood on a low cliff overlooking the sea, its dark stone facade rising solemnly against a sky heavy with clouds. The building was old Victorian, perhaps earlier, and carried with it the air of a place that had seen secrets whispered behind closed doors for generations. Poirot arrived just before dusk. The taxi crunched along the gravel drive, stopping before a pair of massive oak doors. Before Poirot could reach for his valise, the doors opened. A tall man stood framed in the doorway. He was thin, impeccably dressed, his hair silver at the temples. His eyes, sharp, calculating, took Poirot in at once. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, bowing slightly. "Welcome to Arden Hall. My name is Sebastien Vale." Poirot returned the bow. "You have the advantage of me, Monsieur Vale." "Indeed. Though not for long, I suspect." That, Poirot thought, was an interesting choice of words. Inside, the hall was warm and softly lit. Oil paintings lined the walls, stern-faced men and elegant women, all gazing outward with expressions that seemed almost knowing. Poirot felt, not for the first time, the sensation of being watched. "You received my letter," Vale said as they walked. "I did. And you came. I am here." Vale smiled thinly. "Then the game has begun." Poirot stopped walking. "Ah," he said gently. "You confirm what I suspected. This is not a social gathering, Monsieur Vale. It is a game." "Yes," Vale replied without hesitation. "A game of faces." The drawing room was already occupied. Poirot counted them at once 6 people, arranged with careful casualness, as though each had chosen a position that revealed something while concealing much more. Sebastien Vale gestured toward them. "Allow me to introduce our guests." Closest to the fireplace stood a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, elegant, her posture perfect. She wore a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Miss Evelyn Carrington," Vale said. "An art restorer." Poirot inclined his head. "Art," he murmured. "Yes, restoration. Repairing what is damaged while deciding how much of the original truth to preserve." Miss Carrington's smile tightened. Next was a broad-shouldered man with a soldier's bearing. His face lined, his eyes alert. Colonel Richard Halloway. Retired. "Retired soldiers," Poirot said thoughtfully, "are often more dangerous than those still in uniform." Halloway's jaw clenched. A third figure sat in an armchair. A man perhaps in his 40s, with round spectacles and nervous hands that never quite stilled. "Mr. Leonard Finch," Vale said. "A barrister." Poirot's eyes lingered on the man's fingers. "A man who argues for a living," he said softly, "and perhaps against his own conscience." Finch swallowed. Near the window stood a woman dressed in severe black, her hair pulled back tightly. Her expression was controlled, almost cold. Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe, philanthropist. "A noble profession," Poirot remarked. "Charity often hides the most complicated motivations." Ashcombe said nothing. The fifth guest was a younger man. Handsome, restless, his charm worn like a polished coat. Julian Moore, investor. "Ah," Poirot said. "One who trades in futures, and perhaps gambles with the past." Moore laughed lightly, though his eyes flicked away. Finally, standing slightly apart from the others, was a woman who immediately caught Poirot's attention. She was unremarkable, at first glance plain dress, modest posture, but her eyes were extraordinary. They watched everything. "Miss Clara Whitby," Vale said. "A private secretary." Poirot studied her carefully. "A profession built on silence," he said. "An observation." For the first time, Miss Whitby smiled, and then just as quickly, the smile vanished. 7 guests. 7 faces, and one host who had invited them all to play. Dinner was a formal affair, served in a long, high-ceilinged room overlooking the sea. Conversation flowed easily enough, yet Poirot felt the undercurrent of tension at once. Each guest spoke with care, measuring every word. Masks, Poirot thought. All of them thought Sebastian Vale presided at the head of the table, watching, listening, encouraging just enough speech to keep the evening from descending into silence. "To our gathering," Vale said at last, raising his glass. "May truth find us before destruction does." An odd toast. The glasses clinked. Poirot did not drink. Instead, he watched Miss Carrington avoided Colonel Halloway's gaze. Finch flinched whenever Julian Moore laughed too loudly. Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes lingered on Miss Whitby with something like suspicion or fear. And Vale? Vale watched them all with the patience of a chess player. When dessert had been cleared, Vale rose. "My friends," he said, "it is time to explain why you are here." A murmur rippled around the table. "You were all chosen," Vale continued, "because each of you has built a life upon a lie. A lie so carefully constructed that you may almost believe it yourself." "That's absurd," Moore protested. Vale's eyes flicked to him. "Is it?" Poirot leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "This is the moment," he thought, "when the masks are tested." "Over the next few days," Vale said, "those lies will be challenged, exposed, one by one. By the end of the week, the truth will be undeniable." "And if we refuse to play?" Colonel Halloway asked. Vale smiled. "You already are." Later that night, Poirot stood alone in his guest room, gazing at his reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back at him was calm, composed, but even Poirot knew the truth. Every face was a mask. Some were simply better crafted than others. There came a soft knock at the door. Poirot opened it, to find Miss Whitby standing in the corridor, her expression tense. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "you must be careful." "Careful of what, mademoiselle?" "Of him," she said. "Sebastian Vale is not what he seems." Poirot smiled gently. "My dear Miss Whitby," he replied, "I assure you none of us are." As she turned and disappeared down the corridor, Poirot closed the door softly. The game had begun, and somewhere within Arden Hall, the first mask was already beginning to crack. Asterisk Part 2. A house where everyone, Lie's morning at Arden Hall arrived without sunlight. A dense mist rose from the sea and pressed itself against the tall windows, blurring the boundary between the house and the world beyond. To Poirot, it was as though Arden Hall had withdrawn deliberately from reality, choosing instead to exist within its own carefully curated deception. Poirot rose early, as was his habit. Order, he believed, was a form of truth, and truth, even when unwelcome, responded best to discipline. He rang for tea. George was not there, of course. Instead, a young maid appeared, pale and quiet, her eyes fixed respectfully on the carpet. "You may place it there," Poirot said gently, indicating the small table near the window. As she poured, Poirot studied her reflection in the mirror. Her hands trembled slightly. "You have been here long?" he asked casually. "Only 3 months, sir." "And in those 3 months, have you found this house peaceful?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "Enough." "No, sir," she said finally, then flushed and curtsied quickly before leaving the room. Poirot smiled faintly. "Even the walls know," he murmured. "They always do." Breakfast was served promptly at 8. One by one, the guests assembled in the dining room, each wearing a different version of civility. Miss Carrington appeared immaculate, her hair perfectly arranged, her voice light as she discussed the weather, though there was no weather to speak of. Only fog. Colonel Holloway sat rigidly, his back straight, eyes scanning the room with habitual alertness. Leonard Finch arrived last, visibly flustered. Apologizing too much. Sebastian Vale entered precisely on time. "I trust you all slept well," he said pleasantly. A murmur of agreement followed. Poirot noticed that no one made eye contact with anyone else. Vale took his seat. "Excellent. Then we may proceed." "With breakfast?" Julian Moore asked lightly. "With honesty," Vale replied. Silence fell like a dropped glass. Vale folded his napkin carefully. "Today, we begin with the smallest of lies. The ones you tell not to others, but to yourselves." Poirot stirred his tea slowly. "You will forgive me, Monsieur Vale," he said, "but already I am curious." "Why begin small?" Vale's gaze met his. "Because small lies grow," he said. "They always do." The morning was structured with unnerving precision. After breakfast, Vale invited them to the library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books, many of which Poirot suspected were chosen for appearance rather than use. A fire burned low in the grate. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, like a tribunal. Finch muttered under his breath, "Or a confession." Mrs. Ashcombe replied coolly. Vale stood before them. "Each of you will be asked a question," he said. "You may answer or you may refuse. But refusal is also an answer. And who appointed you judge?" Holloway demanded. Vale smiled. "You did. When you accepted my invitation." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Touché." Vale turned first to Miss Carrington. "Evelyn Carrington," he said. "You are an art restorer. Tell us, have you ever altered a piece beyond restoration?" Her lips parted. She closed them again. "That's a ridiculous question," she said. "Art restoration is interpretation. There's no absolute line." Vale nodded. "So you admit that sometimes the original is lost?" Her eyes flashed. "Sometimes it was never there to begin with." Poirot noted the tension in her shoulders. Vale moved on. "Colonel Holloway, you retired with honors. No scandals. No inquiries. Is that correct?" "Yes." Vale tilted his head. "And the men under your command, would they say the same?" Holloway's face darkened. "My record speaks for itself." Vale smiled thinly. "Records are written by survivors." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Next was Finch. "Mr. Finch, as a barrister, you have defended the guilty. That's my job. And have you ever believed a client innocent only to discover otherwise?" Finch swallowed. "Of course." Vale leaned forward. "And did you continue to defend them?" Silence. Poirot watched a bead of sweat form at Finch's temple. "Yes," Finch said finally. "I did." Vale straightened. "Thank you for your honesty." Finch looked as though honesty had cost him dearly. Julian Moore was next. "You invest in opportunity. Vale said. "But tell me, have you ever profited from another's ruin?" Moore laughed. "That's business." Vale's eyes hardened. "Is it?" Moore's laughter faltered. Mrs. Ashcombe answered her question with icy composure, admitting nothing, revealing less. Miss Whippy's response was brief and careful, too careful. When it was done, Vale turned to Poirot. "And you, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "what lie do you tell yourself?" Poirot did not hesitate. "That I am finished," he said calmly. "That my work is behind me. That I observe now merely for amusement." Vale regarded him thoughtfully. "And is it a lie?" Poirot smiled. "We shall see." That afternoon, the guests dispersed uneasily. Some retreated to their rooms. Others wandered the grounds, though the fog rendered the gardens ghostlike and disorienting. Poirot chose the library. He examined the shelves closely. Many volumes were new. Others had not been opened in years. But one section caught his attention: biographers, military histories, legal memoirs, art catalogs. Lives, carefully curated. He was studying a slim volume on battlefield command when he heard footsteps behind him. Miss Whitby stood in the doorway. "You like books, Monsieur Poirot?" "I like what people choose to keep," he replied. She hesitated, then entered. "You don't trust him," she said quietly. "I trust nothing that invites me to a game," Poirot replied. "Especially one with rules I did not write." She lowered her voice. "Sebastian Vale is not his real name." Poirot turned. "Ah, now that is interesting. I've seen his handwriting before," she said. "Under a different name. Years ago. And where was that?" She shook her head. "I can't say." "Not yet." Poirot studied her face, the tension around her mouth, the alertness of her eyes. "You are afraid," he said gently. "Yes. Of him?" "Of what happens when the truth comes out." Poirot nodded. "Truth," he said softly, "is rarely polite." Before she could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Miss Whippy stepped back at once. "Be careful," she whispered again, and was gone. The scream came just after dusk. It shattered the quiet of Arden Hall, echoing through corridors and staircases alike. Poirot was on his feet at once. The sound had come from the east wing. He moved swiftly, though without panic. Panic, he knew, obscured observation. Others emerged from their rooms, faces pale, voices raised. Together they converged on a closed door at the end of the corridor. Sebastian Vale arrived last. "Stand back," he said. Opening the door. Inside, the room was empty. The window stood open, curtains billowing in the cold air. The room showed signs of disturbance: a chair overturned, papers scattered across a desk. On the floor lay a single object, a mask. It was theatrical, ivory-colored, its painted smile grotesquely wide. Poirot bent down and picked it up carefully. "A symbol," Vale said softly. "No," Poirot replied. "A message." Miss Carrington stared at it. "Whose room is this?" Vale's expression was unreadable. "Leonard Finch's." A stunned silence followed. "But Finch's—" Moore began. A voice cut through the fog of confusion. "I'm here." Leonard Finch stood at the end of the corridor, shaken but unharmed. "I was attacked," he said hoarsely. "Someone was waiting in my room." Vale's eyes gleamed. "Then," he said, "the game has escalated." Poirot looked down at the mask in his hands. This, he thought, is no longer merely a game of faces. It was becoming something far more dangerous. Part 3. Masks. Mirrors and motives. The mask lay upon the table in the drawing room like a silent accusation. Ivory-colored, delicately carved. Its painted smile frozen in mockery, too joyful, too deliberate. Poirot examined it closely beneath the lamplight, turning it just enough to catch the faint scratches along its inner edge. "Handled often," he murmured, "and not recently made." Leonard Finch sat rigidly on the sofa, his face drained of color. "I've never seen it before," he insisted. "I swear it." "No one has accused you yet," Poirot replied gently. Sebastian Vale stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, observing the group as though they were figures on a board. "An attempt at intimidation," Vale said. Or perhaps something more theatrical. Or symbolic, Mrs. Ashcombe said coolly. This entire gathering reeks of symbolism. Poirot glanced at her. Symbols, madame, are merely truths that fear to speak plainly. Finch's account, when finally extracted, was halting but clear enough. He had returned to his room after supper, sensing unease, but attributing it to the strange atmosphere of the house. As he reached his desk, a figure emerged from behind the curtains. A mask? Poirot asked. Yes, Finch said hoarsely. That mask. He didn't speak. Just stood there, staring. And then? He lunged at me. I shoved him away and ran. Did you see his face beneath the mask? Finch shook his head. No, but he was tall, strong. Colonel Holloway shifted slightly. Poirot noticed. And the window? Poirot continued. Open already. I think no. I'm sure that was his escape. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A theatrical villain. Julian Moore scoffed. This is absurd. No, Poirot said quietly. This is intentional. Vale smiled. You see why I invited you, Monsieur Poirot? Yes, Poirot replied. And you see why I am uneasy about you. Vale's smile did not falter. Later that night, Poirot requested permission to examine the house. Of course, Vale said smoothly. Arden Hall has nothing to hide. Poirot almost smiled. The east wing corridor was narrow, lined with mirrors tall, old-fashioned, their silver backs darkened with age. Poirot paused before one of them. Mirrors, he murmured. They reveal only what is placed before them. Never the whole. He examined Finch's room carefully. The overturned chair suggested struggle, but no signs of forced entry. The desk drawers were open, but nothing appeared missing. Poirot moved to the window. The sill bore faint scuff marks. A man who escapes through a window leaves more than fear behind. Poirot said softly. Footsteps sounded behind him. Miss Whitby stood at the door. You wanted to see me? She asked quietly. Yes, Poirot said. Tell me, does Mr. Finch have reason to be frightened? She hesitated. Everyone here does. Poirot studied her. You are careful with your words. I have to be. Poirot lowered his voice. You said you recognized Vale's handwriting. Yes. From where? She closed the door behind her. From court documents. Years ago. A man who changed his name after a scandal. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A scandal involving whom? She hesitated again. Too long this time. Mr. Finch, she said finally. Poirot exhaled slowly. So, the web tightens. The next morning, tension clung to Arden Hall like damp air. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Finch barely touched his food. Miss Carrington watched him with thinly veiled concern or calculation. Afterward, Poirot invited the guests to remain. Yesterday, he said, we spoke of small lies. Today, I should like to speak of motives. Vale inclined his head approvingly. Poirot turned first to Miss Carrington. You restore art, he said. Tell me, have you ever signed another's work as your own? Her eyes widened. That's outrageous, is it? Poirot asked calmly. Because several pieces attributed to you bear stylistic inconsistencies. Her composure cracked, just slightly. I had help, she said sharply. Is that a crime? Not necessarily, Poirot replied. Unless the helper is someone you wish to erase. Her silence was answer enough. Poirot moved on. Colonel Holloway. You said records are written by survivors. Were there men under your command who did not survive and whose stories were never told? Holloway's face hardened. War demands decisions. And sometimes, Poirot said gently, those decisions demand scapegoats. Holloway rose abruptly. I will not be interrogated like a criminal. Poirot met his gaze. Then you should not behave like one. Vale intervened smoothly. Enough for now. Poirot nodded. Very well. Then let us speak of Leonard Finch. Finch flinched. You defended a man accused of fraud, Poirot continued. A man who later vanished. Finch's voice trembled. I did my duty. And when the evidence was discovered after the verdict? Finch whispered. I buried it. A collective gasp filled the room. Vale's eyes gleamed. Ladies and gentlemen, he said softly, our first mask slips. Finch collapsed into his chair, his face in his hands. Poirot watched Vale carefully. Confession, Poirot thought, is power, and Vale enjoys it far too much. That evening, Poirot stood once more before the mirror in his room. He removed his mustache wax carefully, methodically. The house was playing its own reflection back at him, lies upon lies, faces upon faces. A knock came. This time, it was Colonel Holloway. "I didn't attack Finch," he said bluntly. Poirot nodded. "I know." Holloway frowned. "You do?" "Yes. The man who attacked him wanted fear, not silence." "Then who?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Someone who benefits from watching others fracture." Holloway's eyes widened. "Vale, perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps someone who wears the mask more convincingly." As Holloway left, Poirot returned his gaze to the mirror. "Soon," he murmured, "the masks will fall. And when they do, someone will not survive it." Outside, the sea crashed violently against the cliffs, and somewhere within Arden Hall, a second lie was already preparing to die. Part 4. The first shattered alibi night settled heavily over Arden Hall, pressing against its stone walls like a living thing. The wind had risen, carrying with it the low, restless moan of the sea below the cliffs. To Poirot, the sound was not merely atmospheric, it was anticipatory. Something, he felt, was about to break. Poirot had just finished arranging the objects on his bedside table, everything aligned with exacting precision, when a sharp knock sounded at the door. "Enter," he said, Sebastian. Vale stepped inside without waiting for permission. His expression was composed, but there was an energy about him that had not been there before. "You are accelerating matters," Vale said. Poirot regarded him calmly. "Truth accelerates itself, Monsieur Vale. I merely remove obstacles." Vale smiled thinly. "You expose them too quickly." "Ah," Poirot replied. "Then you admit exposure is your intention." Vale did not deny it. "You must understand," he said. "This house was built for revelation." Poirot stood. "No house is built for truth," he said softly. "Only for secrets." Vale studied him for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "Sleep well, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Tomorrow will be decisive." When the door closed, Poirot remained standing. "Decisive," he murmured. "Yes, for someone." The scream came just after midnight. This time, it was unmistakably different from the first, shorter, sharper, and abruptly cut off. Poirot was out of his room in seconds. Doors flew open along the corridor as the others emerged, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. It came from the south wing, Miss Carrington said breathlessly. They ran out the door to the music room stood ajar. Light spilled out across the carpet. Poirot entered first. Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe lay on the floor beside the piano, one hand outstretched, her body twisted unnaturally. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. She was very much dead. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Julian Moore swore under his breath. Colonel Holloway knelt, placing 2 fingers gently against her neck. He looked up and shook his head once. "She's been dead only minutes." Poirot's gaze swept the room. The overturned piano stool, the shattered metronome on the floor, the faint smell of perfume, too strong to be accidental. "A confrontation?" Poirot said quietly. "And a violent one." Sebastian Vale stepped forward, his face pale but composed. "So," he said, "the game claims its first life." Poirot turned on him sharply. "This is no game now," he said. "This is murder." Vale's eyes flickered, but only for an instant. "Then we must discover the murderer," he said. "Must we not?" Poirot studied him. "Yes," he said. "We must. And quickly before the house claims another." They gathered in the drawing room, shaken and silent. Outside, the wind howled like an accusation. Poirot stood apart, his thoughts moving rapidly. "Everyone here had opportunity," Vale said. "We were all in our rooms, or so we claim." "Claims," Poirot echoed. "Yes, let us speak of those." He turned first to Julian Moore. "Where were you at midnight?" "In my room," Moore replied quickly. "Reading." "What?" Moore hesitated. "A magazine." Poirot nodded slightly, then turned away. Colonel Holloway? Walking the west corridor. I couldn't sleep. Anyone see you? No. Poirot's eyes moved on. Miss Carrington? In the gallery, she said. Sketching. At midnight? I work best at night. Poirot smiled faintly. Mr. Finch? I was awake, Finch said shakily. But I never left my room. I was afraid. Poirot's gaze settled last on Miss Whitby. I was organizing papers for Mr. Vale, she said. In his study. All eyes turned to Vale. Yes, Vale confirmed. She was with me. Poirot said nothing. Instead, he walked slowly back to the music room. The body had not yet been moved. Poirot knelt carefully beside Mrs. Ashcombe. He examined her hands. Her neckline, the faint bruise beneath her jaw. Strangulation, he murmured. Quick, controlled. His eyes moved to the piano. The sheet music lay open. Chopin, he said softly. A nocturne. He looked closer. The pages were torn deliberately. Poirot stood and examined the room again. Someone wanted to silence her, he said, but also to send a message. He returned to the drawing room. Double quotes. Mrs. Ashcombe was not killed in a moment of rage, Poirot announced. She was killed because she knew something. Vale folded his arms. And what did she know? Poirot looked directly at him. About you. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Vale laughed softly. You overestimate her importance. On the contrary, Poirot said. I think you underestimated her courage. He turned to the others. Double quotes. Mrs. Ashcombe was not merely a philanthropist. She was a silent benefactor to several legal inquiries, one of which concerned a man who vanished after a fraud trial. Finch went white. She knew, Poirot continued. That evidence had been suppressed, and she knew who had suppressed it. All eyes shifted to Finch. I didn't kill her. Finch cried. I know, Poirot said gently. Then who? Moore demanded. Poirot's voice hardened. The person whose alibi has just shattered. He turned slowly towards Sebastian Vale. You say Miss Whitby was with you in your study, Poirot said. Yet the study clock stopped at 11:40. Vale stiffened. And Miss Whitby, Poirot continued, was seen near the music room minutes before the scream by the maid. Miss Whitby gasped. That is impossible, Vale said sharply. Is it? Poirot replied. Because someone moved freely through the house while the rest of you believed yourselves observed. The room was deathly silent. Poirot's eyes burned with certainty. One alibi is false, he said, and its collapse has already cost a life. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. The first truth had demanded blood, and the house of lies was no longer stable. Asterisk. Part 5. A death behind the smile morning crept into Arden Hall reluctantly, as though even daylight hesitated to witness what had occurred within its walls. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a heavy stillness. The sea below the cliffs was calm, now too calm, its surface smooth, like glass hiding depth and danger beneath. Poirot stood by the window of the drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back. Sleep had not come easily. Murder, he reflected, always rearranged the atmosphere of a house. It stripped away pretense. It sharpened fear. Behind him. The others gathered in uneasy silence. Mrs. Ashcombe's body had been removed to a small side room. The piano lid in the music room remained closed now, as though the instrument itself wished to forget. Sebastian Vale broke the silence. We cannot continue like this, he said. A woman is dead. Accusations fly freely. We need order. Poirot turned slowly. Order, he repeated. Yes, but not the kind imposed by control. The kind born of truth. Vale's jaw tightened. You suggest I am controlling this? I suggest, Poirot said gently, that you have designed it. Poirot asked them to sit. There are two important facts, he began. First, Mrs. Ashcombe was strangled by someone physically capable and calm. Second, she was lured to the music room. Asterisk. Lured? Miss Carrington echoed. Double quotes. Yes. The torn sheet music was not random. Mrs. Ashcombe once funded a musical conservatory. Chopin was her weakness. Miss Carrington inhaled sharply. How do you know that? Poirot smiled faintly. Because philanthropy, like guilt, leaves patterns. Vale folded his arms. You imply premeditation, I stated. Poirot's gaze moved deliberately from face to face. Now let us discuss alibis again, but this time with precision. He turned to Colonel Holloway. You walked the west corridor. You passed the music room at 11:45. Yes. And did you hear anything? No. Poirot nodded. Because at that time, Mrs. Ashcombe was still alive. Holloway frowned. How can you be certain? Because the metronome in the music room was broken during the struggle. Its internal spring stopped at 11:52. A murmur rippled through the group. Poirot turned next to Julian Moore. You were reading in your room. A magazine, yes. Poirot picked up a small object from the table. This magazine, he said. Found in the gallery this morning. Moore stared. That's impossible, is it? Poirot asked calmly. You said you never left your room. Moore's confidence faltered. I must have taken a walk earlier. After midnight? Silence. Poirot said nothing further and turned to Finch. You stayed in your room, Poirot said. Out of fear. Yes, Finch whispered. I locked the door. And yet, Poirot said, your door was unlocked when the maid checked after the scream. Finch shook violently. I don't remember unlocking it. Poirot's eyes softened. Fear causes forgetfulness. Then he faced Miss Whitby. You were in the study with Mr. Vale. Yes. For how long? Until midnight. And after? She hesitated. I returned to my room. Poirot nodded slowly. And you, Monsieur Vale? Vale met his gaze evenly. I remained in my study all night. Poirot's voice dropped. No, you did not. The room froze. You left your study, Poirot continued, at 11:48. You walked to the music room. You confronted Mrs. Ashcombe. Vale laughed. On what evidence? Poirot gestured toward the piano bench. There is a faint smear of wax polish, he said. The same polish used only on the floors of your study. Vale's smile thinned. And you, Poirot added, were the only person who knew she would come, if summoned by music. Vale's eyes darkened. You are speculating. Poirot stepped closer. No, I am reconstructing. Miss Carrington stood abruptly. This is madness, she said. You're accusing the host. Poirot looked at her intently. No, he said. I am accusing the director. Vale's composure cracked at last. You think I killed her? He said quietly. I think, Poirot replied, that you frightened her into silence, and when silence failed, you ensured it. Miss Whitby gasped. Sebastian. Vale raised a hand sharply. Enough. For a moment, Poirot thought he might confess. Instead, Vale smiled. Very impressive, Monsieur Poirot, he said. But you forget something. What? That I am not the only one who wanted her dead. Vale turned suddenly toward Miss Carrington. She discovered your forgery, he said. She planned to expose you. Miss Carrington went white. That's a lie. And Julian Moore, Vale continued smoothly, lost a fortune through one of her investments. And Colonel Holloway, she financed an inquiry into your wartime conduct. Chaos erupted of voices, overlapping, accusations flying. Poirot raised his voice sharply. Silence. The room stilled. Vale speaks truth mixed with poison, Poirot said. Yes, many here had motive, but only one controlled the timing. He pointed again to Vale. The murder occurred when you believed everyone watched everyone else. Vale's eyes glittered. Then prove it, he said. Softly. Poirot nodded. I will. That night, Poirot did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the library, assembling fragments, movements, expressions, lies dotted 2 in the morning. Footsteps approached. Julian Moore appeared. Pale, sweating. I didn't kill her, he said. But I know who might have. Poirot gestured for him to sit. Tell me. Moore swallowed. I saw Miss Whitby near the music room before the scream. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. So, he murmured. The smile hides another mask. At that very moment, a sound echoed from upstairs, a heavy thud, followed by a cry abruptly cut short. Poirot was on his feet instantly. Another. he whispered. "The house is demanding its price." He ran. The game was no longer about exposure, that it was about survival. Part 6. Faces. That change in the dark. The corridor outside the guest rooms was in chaos. Doors stood open. Voices echoed, sharp with panic. Someone was crying softly, uncontrollably. Poirot pushed forward with surprising speed, his small frame driven by urgency rather than fear. The sound had come from the upper east wing. As he reached the last door, Colonel Holloway was already there, standing rigid. One hand braced against the wall. "It's Moore," he said grimly. Julian Moore. Poirot entered. Julian Moore lay sprawled beside the bed, one arm twisted beneath him, his face turned toward the ceiling. His eyes were open, wide with shock, his mouth frozen in an expression that was not quite terror but recognition. Poirot knelt immediately. "No struggle," he murmured. "No defensive wounds. How?" Miss Carrington whispered from the doorway. Poirot straightened slowly. He was poisoned. A collective gasp filled the room. They reconvened once more in the drawing room. But the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. This was no longer a gathering of secrets. It was a siege. 2 deaths. 2 silences forced upon truth. Poirot stood at the center, his voice low but absolute. "Julian Moore did not die by accident," he said. He was silenced because he was about to speak. Sebastian Vale leaned against the mantelpiece, his expression grave. "He came to you," Vale said, watching Poirot carefully. "What did he say?" Poirot met his gaze. "Enough to die for." Miss Whitby looked away. Poirot noticed. "Julian Moore was poisoned," Poirot continued, "with a fast-acting alkaloid. Tasteless, colorless. Delivered through the brandy he drank earlier this evening." Finch gasped. "But the brandy was served to all of us." "Yes," Poirot said. "But only 1 glass was poisoned. Who poured it?" Colonel Holloway asked. Poirot turned. "The person who knows how to serve without being noticed." All eyes shifted slowly, inexorably, to Miss Whitby, her face drained of color. "That's absurd," Vale snapped. "She is my secretary." Poirot's gaze did not leave her. "And a very good one," he said. "Efficient, invisible, trusted." Miss Whitby's hands trembled. "I would never." Poirot raised a hand. "Do not yet defend yourself, mademoiselle. Let us examine why Julian Moore died." He paced slowly. "Julian Moore lost money, yes. But more importantly, he discovered something. He recognized handwriting. Yours, Miss Whitby." Her breath caught. "You assisted in preparing documents for Mr. Vale," Poirot continued. "Documents connected to old legal proceedings." Miss Whitby whispered. "You don't understand." "Oh," Poirot said gently. "I understand very well." He turned to the others. Miss Whitby was not merely a secretary. She was once a clerk in a barrister's office, Mr. Finch's office. Finch staggered back. No, that was years ago." "Yes," Poirot said. "And during that time, evidence disappeared." Miss Whitby's voice broke. "I didn't know what it meant then. But you know now," Poirot said softly. Vale's voice cut in sharply. "This is conjecture." Poirot turned to him. "No, Monsieur Vale. This is structure. And you provided the framework." Miss Carrington suddenly laughed high, brittle. "We're tearing each other apart," she said. "Is that what you wanted, Vale?" Vale said nothing. Poirot watched him carefully. "You did not kill Julian Moore," Poirot said suddenly. Vale's eyes flickered. "No," Poirot continued, "because Moore's death was not theatrical enough for you." Silence. Poirot turned back to Miss Whitby. "You poisoned Moore," he said calmly, "because he saw you near the music room and because he recognized your handwriting." Miss Whitby collapsed into a chair. "I didn't kill Mrs. Ashcombe," she sobbed. "But Moore, he was going to destroy everything." "Everything?" Poirot asked. She looked up, tears streaking her face. "The truth," she whispered. That night, the house did not sleep. Colonel Holloway stood guard in the corridor. Finch remained locked in his room. Miss Carrington paced like a caged animal. Poirot sat alone in the library. 2 killers, he thought. 2 masks, but only 1 architect. The fire crackled softly. Poirot spoke aloud to the empty room. "Soon, Monsieur Vale, he murmured. Your mask too will fall. As if in response, the grandfather clock struck 3 dot, and in the darkness above, someone listened. Part 7. The false confession dawn broke reluctantly over Arden Hall, staining the fog with a weak, colorless light. The house felt exhausted, like a body that had fought through the night and survived. But only just. Poirot had not slept. He sat at the small writing desk in the library, his little gray cells moving with relentless clarity. 2 deaths. 2 killers, or so it appeared. Yet appearances, Poirot reminded himself, were merely masks demanding removal. At precisely 7 o'clock, Sebastian Vale rang the bell. The sound echoed through the house like a summons. They gathered in the drawing room. Once more. Miss Whitby sat apart from the others, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finch looked older, diminished. Miss Carrington stood near the window, staring out at the sea as though contemplating escape. Colonel Holloway remained rigid, watchful. Vale stood at the center. I will not allow further chaos, he said. Someone must take responsibility. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Vale turned slowly and faced Miss Whitby. You have confessed to poisoning Julian Moore, he said calmly. That alone is enough to involve the authorities. Miss Whitby flinched. But, Vale continued, there is more. You were also seen near the music room before Mrs. Ashcombe's death. A ripple of shock passed through the group. Poirot stepped forward. You are constructing a narrative, he said quietly. Vale ignored him. Miss Whitby, Vale said. Tell them. The room held its breath. Miss Whitby stood. Her voice trembled. But it did not break. I killed them, she said. Both of them. Silence followed, thick, suffocating. Finch gasped. Clara, no. I strangled Mrs. Ashcombe, Miss Whitby continued, staring straight ahead. She threatened to expose the truth about the missing evidence. Julian Moore discovered what I'd done. I poisoned him. Poirot felt it at once, the wrongness of it. The cadence. The choice of words, a rehearsed confession. Poirot spoke sharply. No. All eyes turned to him. That, Poirot said, is not the truth. It is a performance. Vale smiled faintly. Are you calling her a liar, Monsieur Poirot? Yes, Poirot said. And a frightened one. Miss Whitby's shoulders sagged. Poirot moved closer. Look at her hands, he said to the others. They shake not with guilt, but with terror. Vale interjected smoothly. Guilt manifests differently. Poirot rounded on him. And strangulation, Poirot said, requires physical confidence. Miss Whitby has none. Mrs. Ashcombe fought back. Miss Whitby whispered, I had help. Poirot shook his head. You had instruction, he corrected gently. Poirot turned to Finch. Mr. Finch, who told Miss Whitby what to say. Finch stared at him in horror. I didn't. Poirot cut him off. Not you. Someone who has directed every movement in this house. Vale's expression hardened. You go too far. Poirot smiled thinly. No. Monsieur Vale, you went too far when you decided truth should bleed. He addressed the room. Miss Whitby poisoned Julian Moore, yes. But she did so under pressure. Blackmail. Miss Whitby began to sob. He said he'd ruin me, she whispered. That my life would end. Who? Holloway demanded. She looked at Vale. He did. The room exploded with sound. You manipulated her, Poirot said quietly. You fed her fear. You watched her collapse, and then you asked her to confess to everything. Vale laughed softly. You weave a dramatic tale. Poirot stepped closer. And yet, he said, you encouraged her to include one fatal error. What error? Vale asked coolly. Poirot's. Eyes gleamed. She claimed to have strangled Mrs. Ashcombe. But Mrs. Ashcombe was left-handed, and the bruising pattern shows the attacker used the right-hand dominant grip. Poirot paused. Miss Whitby is left-handed. Miss. Whitby stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. Vale said nothing. Poirot pressed on. The killer of Mrs. Ashcombe wore gloves treated with wax polish, the same polish. From your study floor. Vale's smile vanished. You? planned this confession, Poirot said, because you believed it would satisfy everyone. Vale straightened. And if it does? Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Then you will kill again. A chill passed through the room. Colonel Holloway stepped forward. He's right. Vale's eyes flicked to him. You need chaos, Poirot continued. It hides your past. A past Mrs. Ashcombe intended to reveal. Vale's voice was low. You have no proof. Poirot nodded slowly. Not yet. That evening, Vale made his move as the house settled into uneasy silence. A fire alarm bell clanged suddenly from the east wing. Fire! Someone shouted. The guests rushed into the corridor. Poirot did not move. Instead, he turned calmly toward the library door. Now, he murmured. Inside, Sebastian Vale stood at the desk, hurriedly gathering papers. Poirot entered quietly. You see, Poirot said, you could not leave without your true face. Vale spun around. You should not have followed me. Poirot smiled. Sadly. Double quotes. No, you should not have underestimated me. Vale reached into his coat. Poirot spoke sharply. The police are already on their way. Vale froze. You used a fire alarm, Poirot continued, to escape through the servants' stairs. But you forgot one thing. What? That liars, Poirot said softly, always look back. Footsteps thundered outside. Vale's shoulders sagged. For the first time, his mask cracked completely. Part 8. Poirot's quiet observations. House fell silent after Sebastian Vale was restrained. Not the peaceful silence of relief, but the hollow quiet that follows revelation. When truth has been dragged into the light and everyone is afraid to look directly at it. Vale sat in the library armchair, his wrists bound loosely with a silk cord taken from the curtain tie-back. Colonel Holloway stood nearby, watchful. Miss Whitby remained seated by the window, staring out at the sea, her face pale and emptied of expression. Poirot did not speak at once. Instead, he adjusted the alignment of books on the table, straightened a chair, and only when order had been restored, did he turn to face them all. This, he said softly, is the most dangerous moment. Vale laughed quietly. Because you think you've won? No, Poirot replied. Because everyone believes the game is over. Poirot seated himself opposite Vale. For days, he began, I have watched you all, not when you spoke, but when you believed yourselves unseen. That is where truth lives. He looked at Miss Carrington. You pace when you are afraid, he said. Always clockwise. It is a habit from long nights in studios where guilt keeps company. She said nothing. Poirot turned to Finch. You avoid mirrors, he continued, because reflection reminds you that law is not the same as justice. Finch's shoulders slumped. Poirot's gaze settled briefly on Holloway. You stand guard even now, Poirot said gently, because command, once tasted, never truly leaves. Finally, Poirot looked at Miss Whitby. And you, he said softly, observe everyone else so you do not have to look inward. Tears slid silently down her face. Poirot inhaled slowly. Now, he said, we will speak of Sebastian Vale. Vale met his gaze calmly. You enjoy this? Poirot shook his head. No, I endure it. You are not Sebastian Vale, Poirot said. No, Vale replied easily. I have never denied that. Your true name, Poirot continued, was once known in courtrooms attached to scandals, forged identities, and collapse cases. Vale's eyes darkened. You were a consultant, Poirot said. An architect of deception. You never committed crimes directly. You designed them. Vale smiled thinly. Design is an art. Then you will appreciate this, Poirot said. He reached into his pocket and removed a folded document. This, he said, is a copy of the suppressed evidence from Mr. Finch's old case. Finch gasped. That was destroyed. No, Poirot replied. It was hidden. Vale's composure slipped for the first time. You coached witnesses, Poirot continued. You altered timelines. And when Mrs. Ashcombe discovered this, when she decided to correct the past, you killed her. Vale leaned back. She threatened the structure, he said calmly. Structures must be preserved. Poirot's voice hardened. Human lives are not architecture. Vale tilted his head. You accuse me of manipulation, he said. But you forget Miss Whitby killed Julian Moore. Poirot nodded. Double quotes, yes, he said. And you made certain she would. Miss Whitby looked up sharply. You placed her under pressure, Poirot continued. You convinced her she was already ruined. You offered her only two paths: obedience or destruction. Vale shrugged. She chose. Poirot leaned forward. No, he said quietly. You chose for her. The room felt suddenly very small. Poirot stood. Julian Moore was poisoned because he recognized handwriting. Mrs. Ashcombe was strangled because she recognized patterns. Both saw behind your mask. Vale's smile returned slow, deliberate. And yet, he said, you still cannot prove I killed her. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. You are correct, he said. I cannot yet. Vale laughed softly. The wait for the authorities stretched on. Outside, fog thickened once more, curling around the house like memory refusing to dissipate. Poirot walked alone through Arden Hall, his footsteps echoing. He stopped before the mirrors in the east wing corridor. Each mirror reflected a different angle, fragmented. Distorted. He studied them carefully. Of course, he murmured. Returning to the music room, Poirot knelt beside the piano bench again. He examined the floor beneath it. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied smile. Back in the drawing room, Poirot addressed them all. There is one final observation, he said. One I deliberately withheld. Vale stiffened. The mirror outside the music room, Poirot said. It reflects the corridor and the study door. He turned to Vale. At 11:48, Poirot said. You left your study. You were seen, but not by a person. He gestured toward the corridor. By the mirror. Vale's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The wax polish, Poirot continued, transferred not only to your gloves, but to the mirror frame. Silence fell like a verdict. Poirot's voice was calm. Final. You did not account for reflection. Vale exhaled slowly. Well played, he said. At that moment, the sound of approaching engines drifted up from the drive below. The police had arrived. Poirot allowed himself a small sigh. Order, he murmured. At last. Part 9. The mask falls. The sound of sirens echoed faintly through the fog as the police approached Arden Hall. It was almost dawn, and the first pale light of day seeped through the high windows, illuminating the heavy stone walls and the dark corridors where so many secrets had been hidden. Inside the drawing room, Sebastian Vale sat restrained in the armchair, his composure fractured. The once calm, confident man now appeared human, fragile in the face of exposure. Miss Whitby remained seated, her hands trembling in her lap. The others, Carrington, Halloway, Moore's memory, still fresh, stood clustered near the fireplace. Silent and apprehensive, Poirot moved deliberately among them, small purposeful steps echoing on the polished floor. His eyes, sharp as ever, scanned every face, every posture, every tremor. Ladies and gentlemen, he said softly, the moment has come when all masks fall. No deception can survive the light for long, especially not here in Arden Hall, where every wall has seen lies whispered behind closed doors. He paused and looked toward Vale. Sebastian Vale, or should I say, your true name has been stripped of pretense. But he's not the only one who is hidden behind a mask. Vale's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to Miss Whitby. You, mademoiselle, poisoned Julian Moore, he said. Yes, but only under coercion. Your mask was that of an obedient secretary. The reality fear manipulated by a master was far more potent. She nodded silently, her eyes glistening with tears. Poirot moved to the center of the room. Now, he said, we examined the first real mask to fall, the one hidden behind smiles and politeness. He turned toward Miss Carrington. Evelyn, you painted over your mistakes in art and in life. Each forgery you produced was a careful lie. And yet, Mrs. Ashcombe discovered the truth. That discovery made her dangerous. You feared exposure, but you did not act violently. Your mask was fragile, but it remained a mask, not a weapon. Miss Carrington shivered, Realizing the subtle accusation in Poirot's words, Poirot looked toward Finch. You, Leonard, carried secrets in your legal career, hidden evidence, suppressed documents. You believed your silence protected yourself, but in reality, it endangered others. Your mask was caution. It is falling now. Finch's jaw tightened. Poirot's eyes finally returned to Vale. Vale, your mask, the mask of the refined, unflappable host, was the most dangerous of all. You orchestrated every movement, every lie, every opportunity. You forced others to play roles they could not understand. And yet, Poirot's voice softened, almost admiringly. Even your cunning could not account for observation. Mirrors do not lie, Monsieur Vale, and neither do I. Vale's hands twitched as he considered the accusation. Poirot continued. Tonight, every mask has been tested. Some have fractured. Some have fallen entirely. 2 deaths occurred because of fear, manipulation, and ambition. But now, the final mask, the one hiding the mastermind, is gone. He gestured to Vale. You control the house, the events, and the people. But even you cannot hide from reflection, logic, and the careful attention of little gray cells. Vale leaned back, defeated yet unbroken in spirit. And what now, Monsieur Poirot? Now, Poirot said, truth is known. The law will attend to you. The lives endangered are revealed. And the masks of all others, the weaker, remain for them to reconcile with themselves. The sound of footsteps on the gravel drive signaled the arrival of the authorities. Officers entered, quickly assessing the scene, taking statements, and preparing to secure Vale. Poirot stood quietly, observing the chaos that order now brought. He glanced at Miss Whitby. You will have to reconcile with your own role, mademoiselle. But remember, you acted out of fear and compulsion. Your conscience must now do its work. She nodded silently, a mixture of relief and horror crossing her face. Poirot then turned to the remaining guests. Today, he said, you have seen what happens when deception becomes reality, and you have witnessed the fall of the most dangerous mask. Never forget what you saw here, how fragile our appearances truly are. He paused, surveying the room. Arden Hall has been a theater, he said quietly, but the play is over, and the final curtain has fallen. Outside, the fog began to lift. For the first time in days, the cliffs, the sea, and the hall itself were visible in the pale dawn light. Shadows retreated, and the air felt cleaner, sharper, freer. The masks had fallen, but the consequences of their hidden lives would echo far longer. Poirot stood in the center of the room, calm, composed, and quietly triumphant. He had observed, deduced, and revealed. As ever, the little gray cells had done their work, and Arden Hall had given up its secrets. Part 10. The final revelation. The morning after Sebastian Vale's capture, Arden Hall was eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to have paused, as though paying homage to the truth that had finally been revealed. The house no longer teemed with suspicion or whispers, yet an invisible weight lingered, one born of fear, guilt, and the consequences of unmasked lies. Poirot moved through the halls with deliberate care. Every corridor, every mirror, every room bore the memory of secrets exposed. He paused before the music room, the scene of the first murder, and examined the floor once again. The faint polish smudges, the displaced sheet music, the subtle angle of the chair, all told the story with an honesty that no confession could match. He spoke softly, more to himself than anyone else, order restored. Yet the echoes remain. The remaining guests gathered in the drawing room, solemn but attentive. Miss Whitby, still pale, seemed to have aged years in a single night. Finch, Carrington, and Colonel Holloway all carried the quiet way of understanding that survival had not absolved them of their own complicity in small deceptions. Poirot cleared his throat before the authorities arrived to finalize Mr. Vale's arrest. He said, "It is necessary to recount the full truth for clarity, for conscience, and for justice." He began methodically, his voice calm, precise. Sebastian Vale orchestrated this house as a game of masks. Each guest was chosen for their weaknesses, their secrets. He manipulated Miss Whitby, coercing her into poisoning Julian Moore, And he directly murdered Mrs. Ashcombe, using the same careful hand that had built a career of deception. Every movement, every lie, every false alibi was under his direction. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, yet even Vale, for all his cunning, could not account for observation, attention, or morality. Each guest, though frightened and complicit in their own ways, contributed inadvertently to revealing him. In other words, the house itself conspired with the truth. Miss Whitby's tears glistened in the morning light. I didn't want to kill him, she whispered. I only wanted to obey, to survive. Poirot nodded gently. Fear is a potent guide, but it is not a justification. You acted, yes, but you also revealed the master behind your actions. Poirot then turned to the others. Leonard Finch, you carried suppressed evidence, believing your silence would protect others. Miss Carrington, your minor deceptions in art were harmless until amplified by Vale's schemes. Colonel Holloway, you relied on authority to maintain order, but the house's chaos tested it. Each of you has learned how delicate appearances are and how dangerous a master manipulator can be. He allowed himself a faint smile. Finally, let us speak of masks themselves. Vale's mask was control. Miss Whitby's was obedience. Finch's was caution. Carrington's was vanity. Holloway's was command. And mine? Poirot's eyes twinkled. My mask is observation. Always observation. And as long as one remains unaware, the little gray cells see more than any face can conceal. At that moment, the police arrived. Officers entered, moving efficiently. Sebastian Vale was escorted from the room. His calmness had returned, but the mask of control was gone. In its place, a quiet recognition of defeat. Poirot watched silently. The officers led him through the halls, past mirrors and corridors that had borne witness to so much deception. Each step sounded like the closing of a chapter. Poirot then turned to the remaining guests. Remember this house, he said softly, not for its fear, but for its lessons. Truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. Masks can conceal, but they cannot change reality. The morning sun now fully illuminated Arden Hall. For the first time in days, the cliffs, the sea, and the house were bathed in clarity. Shadows had receded. Lies had been unmasked. The air smelled of salt wood, and finally freedom. Poirot allowed himself a moment of reflection. Justice, he murmured, is less about punishment than revelation. And today, the revelation is complete. As he walked toward the front entrance, he glanced back once more at Arden Hall. The house, which had been a theater of fear and deceit, now seemed almost serene. As though it had exhaled for the first time, Poirot smiled faintly. The small gray cells already turning toward the next mystery. End of Part 10.